What if the food sitting in your pantry right now, the stuff with the USDA stamp, the familiar logo, the ingredient list you've never once read to the bottom, was quietly banned in dozens of countries? What if the chemicals your government calls safe in moderation are the exact chemicals other governments have formally classified as unfit for human consumption? What if the greatest food safety myth ever told isn't about a specific additive, it's about the country doing the approving? All three are true. 10 American foods have been banned, restricted, or chemically reformulated by foreign governments, not fringe nations, but the EU, Canada, and over 160 countries combined. Hit subscribe, because by the time this video ends, you will never read a nutrition label the same way again. And that is not a small thing. Picture a bag of Skittles. The color is almost violent, reds that don't exist in fruit, yellows that belong in a warning sign, a purple so synthetic it seems to vibrate under fluorescent light. You tear the bag and the smell hits you first, a kind of volcanic artificial sweetness, candy-coated and waxy, the kind of scent your brain filed under Saturday at age 7. You toss a handful back and the shells crack against your teeth, each one dissolving into something bright and impossible and deeply chemically familiar. Most people assume Skittles are just sugar, a guilty pleasure, maybe, but nothing a dentist can't handle. The rainbow is branding. The colors are fun. Nobody ever questioned what makes a Skittle that particular shade of red. But Skittles contain a compound banned in the European Union as a food safety hazard. That compound is titanium dioxide, a whitening and color intensifying agent flagged in 2021 by the European Food Safety Authority as capable of damaging DNA after repeated oral consumption. Sweden and Norway banned Skittles outright. The EU moved to classify titanium dioxide as no longer safe as a food additive, forcing Mars Inc. to quietly reformulate every bag sold on European shelves. The same candy, the same rainbow, two entirely different chemical identities depending on which side of the Atlantic you unwrap it. The dye that makes your candy pop with color is the same compound used to coat industrial surfaces and exterior paint. It disperses light beautifully. It is entirely non-biodegradable. American regulators looked at the same safety data the EU reviewed and drew a different conclusion. The European version of Skittles now exists without it. The American version still doesn't. You've been eating this your entire life, assuming the rainbow was harmless because the bag said nothing to suggest otherwise. What a country permits inside its food tells you exactly what it believes its people deserve to know. Now think about bread. The smell of it, that soft chemical sweetness that meets you in the bread aisle before you've touched a single loaf. You pick up a package and it yields under your fingertips almost too easily, almost too uniformly soft, a pillowy compression that doesn't quite behave like something made from grain and thyme. American commercial white bread smells faintly, strangely, of nothing quite natural. People assume bread is bread. Flour, water, yeast, salt, the most ancient food on Earth, essentially unchanged across 6,000 years of human civilization. But American commercial bread contains a chemical also found inside yoga mats. Azodicarbonamide, introduced into U.S. commercial baking in the 1960s as a flour bleaching and dough strengthening agent, is banned as a food additive across the entire European Union, the UK, Australia, and Singapore. The EU classifies it not as an ingredient, but as an industrial foaming agent. In those countries, using it in bread is illegal. In the United States, it is standard practice on almost every commercial bread line currently operating. Subway made international headlines in 2014 when food blogger Vani Hari, known as the Food Babe, exposed that their sandwich bread contained azodicarbonamide. Subway removed it from every global recipe within weeks. The FDA never required that removal. No regulator demanded it. Subway simply chose. And that gap between what the law demands and what a company quietly decides is where nearly everything on this list lives. The same loaf, baked differently on opposite sides of the ocean, reveals which countries trust their citizens enough to ask what's actually inside it. Picture bacon sizzling, the strips lacquered and curling at the edges, the fat rendering slow and clear, the smell rising like a Sunday morning promise that the day is going to be fine. Crispy American bacon has its own mythology. Unhealthy, yes, but defiantly, unapologetically worth it. You've eaten this your entire life. Most people assume pork is pork, that American bacon and Danish bacon and Chinese pork are essentially the same animal, processed the same way, resting on the same chemical foundation. But American pork carries a drug banned in 160 countries for human safety reasons. Ractopamine, a beta-agonist pharmaceutical administered to American pigs to accelerate muscle growth and reduce body fat, was banned by the European Union in 2009, by China and Russia in 2013, and is restricted or prohibited across 160 nations who formally classify it as unsafe for human consumption. The FDA approved it in 1999. No subsequent federal review has reversed that approval. Ractopamine doesn't fully metabolize before slaughter. It transfers to muscle tissue, and studies have documented tachycardia, muscle tremors, and cardiovascular disruption in humans who consume it in elevated quantities. American pork producers continue using it because it works with industrial precision. Leaner animals, accelerated growth, cheaper processing at scale. The rest of the world reviewed the same data and drew a different line at a different point. The animal is the same. The feed is not. The bacon on your plate in Cincinnati and the bacon on a plate in Frankfurt are two different pharmaceutical propositions wearing the same name. Every chemical approved for food was once approved for something else. The question is always who approved it, and for whose benefit. Think about a chicken processing facility, not the farm, the facility. The scale of it is difficult to hold in your mind. Pale carcasses moving along conveyor lines at industrial pace, the cold air, the faint chemical smell of a space where sanitation is a production variable rather than a principle. American poultry moves through these facilities faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. People assume that if chicken clears USDA inspection, the farm conditions behind it must meet some globally acceptable baseline, that an American certification means something on a universal scale, but the EU didn't ban the chlorine rinse. They banned what made the rinse necessary. Pathogen reduction treatments, including antimicrobial chlorine washes applied to carcasses, have been standard U.S. practice since the 1990s. The European Union banned U.S. chlorine-washed poultry imports in 1997, a prohibition that has remained continuously in force. The EU's formal regulatory position was precise and pointed. No chemical rinse can fully decontaminate meat that arrives heavily contaminated as a result of inadequate hygiene conditions upstream in production. American regulators framed the chlorine bath as an effective intervention. European regulators called it a confession about what the bath was compensating for. The same processing line. Two completely different institutional conclusions about what it reveals. American poultry producers and the USDA have spent over 20 years arguing that the chlorine wash is the solution. The EU has spent 20 years arguing that a solution requiring that level of chemical intervention should not be described as food safety. It should be described as the industrial management of a system designed to run too fast to be clean. The chicken is identical. The philosophy behind it is not. A country's food safety standard is simply a public declaration of how much invisible risk it has decided its citizens should absorb without being asked. Pour Mountain Dew into a glass. The color is unlike any color that occurs in nature, a Chernobyl green, almost luminescent, the kind of shade that reads as radioactive in the reptile part of your brain. The carbonation is aggressive, almost offensive bubbles crashing up fast and sharp. The sweetness that lands on your tongue sits somewhere between citrus and antifreeze, a flavor engineered for maximum intensity rather than any particular resemblance to fruit. Most people assume Mountain Dew is just an extreme soda, over-caffeinated, aggressively marketed, probably too sweet, but ultimately no more dangerous than any other sugar delivery vehicle on the shelf. But Austria and Norway banned the original formula entirely, and the EU quietly replaced what's in the bottle. Mountain Dew's signature color comes from tartrazine, also known as yellow 5, a synthetic azo dye formerly linked to hyperactivity in children, headaches, and behavioral disruption in multiple regulatory reviews. Austria and Norway prohibit the original formula. The version available across most of Europe is reformulated, pulling the recipe closer to what Barney and Ally Hartman, Tennessee bottlers who invented Mountain Dew in the 1940s, originally intended as a regional mixer for whiskey. The Hartmans built a simple regional product. PepsiCo acquired it in 1964 and detonated it into a global lifestyle brand built on precisely the qualities that got it banned: synthetic intensity, frenetic energy, and a color that has no business existing in any naturally occurring substance. Europe sells a quieter version. America sells the original chaos. Consumers on both continents call it the same name and have no idea they're drinking fundamentally different products. The version of yourself you export to the world is never the version you started as. And sometimes the world sends the difference back without comment. Open a Little Debbie Swiss roll. The smell is immediate, chocolate and cream, and something almost too sweet, engineered to arrive in your memory before it arrives on your tongue. The soft cake collapses when you press it, yielding completely, a texture designed in a laboratory in McKee Foods' Tennessee facility to replicate comfort and deliver it reliably every single time. It tastes like a lunchbox. It tastes like $1.994. It tastes like nothing Europeans are legally allowed to eat without being warned. People assume Little Debbie products are harmless nostalgia. Guilty pleasures, certainly, but not the kind of thing that draws regulatory attention. But in Europe, this lunchbox staple carries a cancer warning on every box. Each Little Debbie Swiss roll contains measurable concentrations of yellow 5 and red 40. Research published in peer-reviewed journals has documented that sustained exposure to these dyes causes white blood cells to mutate and tumor cells to proliferate significantly faster than in unexposed samples. Austria and Norway ban the product outright. The EU requires explicit consumer warning labels on packaging carrying these dyes. The same warning classification applied to tobacco products, advising parents that the product may have an adverse effect on activity and attention in children. McKee Foods ships over 900 million product cartons annually across the United States. None reach Austria or Norway. The EU market versions that do ship carry warning text that has no equivalent anywhere on American packaging. The product is chemically identical. The conversation happening around it is not. American parents open a lunchbox. European parents, in the countries that allow the product at all, open a warning label. The snack is the same. The information available to the person eating it is not. What one country calls a snack, another calls a disclosure. And that gap is where the real story of food safety has always lived. Special K sits alone in its aisle positioning, sparse, almost austere, the red and white design deliberately clinical rather than cheerful. The flake itself is thin and crisp and disciplined, not sweet in the way children's cereal is sweet, not fun, not indulgent. It signals restraint. You reach for it when you're trying. It is the cereal that tells the people you live with that you have made a decision. Most people assume if any cereal is fundamentally safe, it is Special K, the adult option, the responsible choice, the one whose marketing has always been about becoming a better version of yourself. But Denmark banned Special K, not for being dangerous. For being too aggressively healthy. Denmark's 2004 ban classified Kellogg's artificially elevated levels of vitamin A, vitamin B6, folic acid, iron, and zinc as exceeding safe daily intake thresholds, particularly for children and pregnant women who consume fortified products at consistent daily frequency. Danish regulators formally categorized the fortification profile as exceeding what naturally sourced food could provide and raising cumulative toxicity concerns in vulnerable populations. In the UK, the Advertising Standards Authority issued a formal rebuke against Kellogg's for overstating the cereal's folic acid benefits in consumer marketing. Kellogg's began aggressive vitamin fortification in the post-war American market, added nutrients as a selling point, a health halo that separated shelf-stable grain from fresh food in consumer perception. Denmark, with a regulatory culture that treats overfortification as its own category of risk, said the health claims had become their own liability. The cereal marketed as the safe choice was banned specifically because of those claims, not despite them. The irony is precise and surgical. The thing that was supposed to make it better was the thing that made it illegal. The healthiest thing on the shelf is only healthy until someone actually checks what's in it. Steak tartare arrives cold and silent. The iron smell of raw beef hits first, deep, mineral, entirely primal. And then you see it. Hand-chopped and carefully mounded, capers scattered across the top, a raw egg yolk resting in the center like a sun. The dish is cold enough that condensation has gathered on the plate. Everything about the presentation is deliberate. It is the kind of food that assumes the person eating it has already decided. Most people assume steak tartare exists above North American regulatory concern. Too French, too niche, too associated with the kind of white tablecloth establishment that quietly operates by different standards than everywhere else. But in 2021, New Brunswick restaurant owners received cease and desist letters for serving it. Canadian food safety law has long required meat to reach an internal temperature of 145 degrees Fahrenheit before service. The rule predated 2021 by decades, but enforcement had been tolerantly inconsistent for precisely the venues where tartare appeared on menus. In 2021, amid COVID-19-era heightened public health vigilance across all provincial systems, New Brunswick public health officials systematically and without warning targeted restaurants serving steak tartare with formal cease and desist orders, citing botulism and parasitic infection risk. The dish had survived in Canadian restaurants for generations on an informal, unspoken tolerance, regulators looking away at the establishments where the clientele felt entitled to assume the risk for themselves. COVID-era public health systems, under pressure and scrutiny they had never previously faced, stopped looking away. A century-old French preparation, beloved by the very class of diner who had never once imagined it could be touched, was suddenly legally indefensible. Not because the dish changed, not because the beef changed, but because the political will to maintain selective enforcement finally ran out. The rule was always there. The enforcement was not luxury, has always operated under its own set of rules, until a crisis arrives and reminds everyone the rules were never actually different. And here's where this story gets genuinely interesting. The crack of a Coca-Cola can is one of the most recognizable sounds on Earth, engineered, tested, and maintained that way by deliberate design. The carbonation rises fast. The The sweetness that follows is so familiar it registers less as a taste than as a memory. Red can, same formula, same sensation, every country, every decade since 1886. Coca-Cola has outlasted empires. It survived 2 world wars. It crossed every cultural and political barrier on the planet. People assume if Coca-Cola is banned anywhere, it is for what is in it. The sugar load, the caffeine, the famously secret formula, the historical cocaine connection that haunts its origin story. But Coke isn't banned for health reasons. It's banned for being American. Coca-Cola is commercially unavailable in exactly 2 countries today. North Korea has refused it since 1950 as part of a comprehensive rejection of American commercial products. Cuba banned it in 1962 when Fidel Castro seized company assets following the implementation of the U.S. trade embargo. The historical detail most people don't know: Cuba was one of the first countries outside the United States to bottle Coca-Cola commercially, a founding bottling partner turned political adversary by the specific logic of geopolitics rather than food science. Unlike every other item on this list, no one banned Coca-Cola to protect their citizens from a chemical. No regulatory body reviewed titanium dioxide or ractopamine and drew a different line. Cuba replaced Coca-Cola with Coca-Cola, a state-produced substitute. North Korea manufactures its own carbonated beverages through state-controlled facilities. The beverage was not the problem. The flag attached to it was the problem. What those 2 governments decided to refuse was not the formula. It was the American economic reach, the American cultural assertion, the particular meaning of a red bottle arriving in a country that had decided it did not want American meaning inside its borders. Sometimes what gets banned isn't the product. It's the story the product insists on telling about where power lives. M&Ms have been engineered since 1941 to deliver chocolate without mess. The hard shell crack first, then the immediate melt beneath. A candy designed originally for soldiers in the field who needed chocolate that wouldn't soften in their hands. The shell is crisp and decisive. The chocolate underneath is immediate. It is a product so precisely designed that it has remained essentially unchanged for over 80 years and distributed in 100 countries. People assume M&Ms are universally beloved, too iconic, too globally distributed, too deeply embedded in the visual language of American snacking to face anything more serious than a minor import tariff. But Sweden banned M&Ms, not for a single chemical, for 2 lowercase letters. When Mars Inc. attempted to introduce M&Ms to the Swedish market in 2009, a Swedish court ruled that the stylized lowercase m, the candy's signature branding mark, was too similar to the trademark belonging to Marabou, the Norwegian-origin chocolate brand that had held Swedish royal warrant since before World War I. Marabou had relocated its manufacturing to Sweden in 1916, becoming embedded so completely in Scandinavian cultural identity over the following 90 years that a court was willing to rule that no American candy could wear the same letter without infringing on something that now belonged legally and culturally to Sweden. Marabou, the brand that won, is now sold in IKEA stores across the United States. That quiet inversion bears repeating. The candy that lost the Swedish trademark war is now available in American stores as a novelty import. The candy that won its Swedish fortress is available in the American stores of a Swedish furniture retailer, entirely on its own terms. The global candy market, it turns out, has its own sense of irony. A letter is just a letter until it belongs to someone, and then it becomes something worth defending in court. 10 items, 10 bans, 10 moments where the most powerful food system in the world ran into a country that looked at the label and said, "Not here." Every single ban on this list is a mirror. Most of them reflect a country making a formal decision to protect its citizens from chemicals that the FDA classified as acceptable in moderation. And then those countries drew the line somewhere different, based on different data, different risk tolerance, and a different answer to the question of who a food safety system is ultimately designed to serve. But the last entries on this list reflect something more uncomfortable than chemistry. Some bans are not about what is in the food at all. They are about what the food means, where it comes from, and whether a country gets to decide what enters its borders, its culture, and its people's bodies on its own terms. The real ingredient America keeps exporting is not titanium dioxide. It is not ractopamine. It is the assumption that American-approved means globally acceptable, and the rest of the world keeps quietly, systematically, persistently disagreeing. Those 3 questions at the start of this video. What if your USDA stamp is not a global guarantee? What if safe in moderation is a negotiated settlement? What if the greatest food safety myth is the country doing the approving? You now have 10 answers. You did not have them an hour ago. If this changed how you look at what is sitting in your pantry right now, if you are reading ingredient lists differently as this video ends, that is exactly what this channel exists for. Hit that like button, because that reaction is the point. Drop it in the comments. Which one actually broke your brain? Most people say the yoga mat bread. A lot of people say the health cereal. Tell us which one you are still thinking about.